Great, so all that liquefy is behind me now in the rear view. I don't have to deal with it ever again. All my edges are fixed. I don't have to worry about that. Next step I'm gonna move on to is my frequency separation and cleaning up the skin and apparel. Now, you might normally think of this as another kind of technical prep step, but the way that we do frequency separation now, this 2.0 version, is done in a different way, and it's actually part of the creative process now. It's not tedious, it's actually fun. With the tools that we use now, it makes it super easy to just wipe away folds that would have taken a really long time and a lot of pain to do previously. So now it's actually fun to do fold removal and apparel cleanup. So let's get started. All right, I'm gonna start with the shorts because I can already see some stuff that I just want to destroy with this method. So I'm gonna run my action in the shorts layer group. Wow, look at that. Look at what median does here. It preserves the edges and the quality and the structure of the underlying pixels on the low layer and just completely wipes this high frequency information. But 6 is too much in this case. I'm going to dial it down right to where it just wipes off all of the grain and most of that mesh detail. I'm okay with keeping just a little bit of that because I know I can wipe that away, and the high frequency structure is going to retain that information. So I'm going to click OK and go with a radius of 4. All right, get ready to check this out. Now we're using the mixer brush. This is going to be insanely fast. I don't even have to worry about the mesh here. Now, think about the way that we used to do this kind of thing and how long what I did just then would have taken. And think about the problems with the previous method of frequency separation and using Gaussian blur in this situation. It would have been totally different. There would have been halos all over the place and it would have looked super fake. Now with median, it's protecting the edges still. It's not creating those halos. And with mixer brush, as opposed to the other tools, which will still work on the low layer, but you can see how good mixer brush is because all we want to do really is move pixels around and blend them. And that's exactly what the mixer brush tool is for. Now, when I get at bigger structural folds like we see here, you need to be a little bit more careful because you can see the mesh is changing as it goes around this fold. So we really want to be a little bit more careful when you come to these areas and just kind of minimize the folds if that's the brief and if that's the direction, rather than completely wiping them because it can still look fake, but just being able to do what I just did in a matter of 15 to 20 seconds is pretty phenomenal. And that's why I'm so excited about this technique. And imagine how this is going to change your workflow and the time that it takes to clean up apparel. Thinking in terms of a frequency separation system now with this advancement is going to completely change the things you say yes to and the things you say no to. In my experience, things that I used to say no to, I can now say, yeah, I can do that, no problem. So that's going to set you apart from the competition because other guys are going to be saying, no, there's no way you can remove those folds. And the client's going to come to you and you're going to be able to have the solution. Now, I really don't mind some of these folds that are coming off the hand here because they're nice and smooth and directional and they really show that tension of the hand hitting the knee. So I don't need to wipe all of these. These are some nice contours. So I'm just going to look for stuff that looks like errors or mistakes or creases. I mean, once again, I can't say it enough. Think about how much care we would have had to take removing these smudges from these areas where these folds exist. Now with Mixer Brush, as long as we're going in the right direction and sort of preserving the underlying information here that we can see on the low, like I can still wipe that fold clean while preserving the fold. And once again, sometimes it's nice to work on the low because you can really see all the variation in there and not be distracted by the information that exists on the high. You can tell here this is a pretty big structural fold, so to remove that at this stage with this level of separation would just be too tough. You wouldn't go attack something that big that's tied up with the information from the mesh here, because you can see how it goes around that fold. Look for that stuff and be sure to preserve that so that you don't do anything that looks fake, but also in this case it actually looks kind of nice, so you don't have to worry about it. Oh, and here's a place that we can really see where the way that we set up all of our tiered mask and layer groups is really working for us. I don't even have to care about when I hit this edge between his arm and the shorts. Normally, if this was just one layer that I was working on, I'd have to be really careful once I got up close to this. But what I really want to do with Mixer Brush on this frequency separation low layer is I want to be able to just brush right into that. So I keep this like continuous tone moving down the shorts. If I had to worry about this edge right here, it would just kind of bunch up against that edge because I wouldn't be able to just wipe through it. So that's a really good example why we set up this way. You relieve yourself from having to worry about that stuff once you're in this mode of really moving fast through the image. And thinking a little bit more conceptually about retouching and the methods that we use, and the reason that we get so excited about advancements and tools and workflow is once we find these combinations of tools and techniques that really work together in these synergistic kind of ways, it makes working actually really a lot of fun. When you're having to do stuff that's so painful with tools that aren't really made for that sort of work, such as, really careful cloning or using dodge and burn in this molecular way for hours and hours. I mean, to some extent, after developing frequency separation using these techniques in this workflow, it renders stuff like dodge and burn kind of useless or dead for this kind of work. We don't really need that anymore. We don't need that granular level, that sort of painful, tedious process, because we found these new tools that really work together to do exactly what you want to do. So let's back off a little bit and see where I'm at with the shorts. The nice thing too here is we're working in a totally non-destructive manner. Let's turn on and off. Take a look at that. What I just did in 5 minutes, what would that have taken before? An hour? Something like that? That's huge. And this can be applied to everything. This can be applied to not only athletic apparel, skin, automotive, even landscape. This is going to completely change the way that we retouch and clean up all of our images. All right, so I haven't even touched the high layer yet, and I'm gonna show you how easy that is too. Now the low is super easy because we're using the mixer brush. The high is now much easier to work with too because we've got a good separation and we can start dealing with any high frequency errors such as spots or dust or any of the mesh there that doesn't look right now that we've wiped the low off of it. So I'm going to switch to the stamp tool. Now this looks a little weird. We can see the line here from the fold still on the high. Some of that went to the high. It kind of had to, but that's pretty easy to wipe now that it's separate from the underlying areas of lightness and darkness. We just kind of stamp from anywhere because at this stage really all we're replacing here in this area is this kind of, it's basically grain, but in the photograph it's the fabric texture, but when we think about it in terms of pixels, it's really just grain information on the high layer. So once we get into the mesh, it's a little bit of a different situation. I can see these turn to black here because they were originally in a different match to a different tonal area with the low, so I'm just going to replace those. And you can do this with overlay turned on or off, and you can also, if you find a dot that you like and you need to use it in multiple places, turn off aligned, hit caps lock to go to your crosshairs, and sample right in the center of a dot that you like. And you can just replace that anywhere because now the clone source is not aligned, so it's always going to clone from that dot right there. This is a super powerful way to just find one element that you think looks good and continue to sample from it in multiple locations. You can see how easy it is to rebuild this mesh here in no time. I'm not going to mess with that stuff up there. That looks okay because it's popped away from the underlying layer, so it should be dark. I'm just going to clean up some of these areas where it looks kind of funny, and I'm just going to move pretty fast here. I'm going to turn a line back on. Turn caps lock off to show the brush again, and I'm going to turn aligned off because I just want to sample some kind of grain. Just get rid of these lines. Now, I just can't say that enough. Imagine how much time that would have taken us to do the old way. I mean, that felt easy. It got good results. I can continue to go in and refine it. I'm bringing back in a little bit of that detail that showed some variation in there. You don't want to completely wipe stuff out of there because it's going to look fake. So now you've seen what's possible with frequency separation using these tools, the true power. So I'm just going to start cruising through and move like I normally would through the rest of the image. I'm just going to clean up all the apparel and just charge through it. So check it out. So I want to draw attention to what I just did there and why this is different, a different way of thinking about using frequency separation, because normally we think about removing folds, creases, imperfections, things that are a lot more general. What I did just there was recreate actual structural information. And that's the ease that we can see once you start thinking in terms of a separated workflow. I don't think of this as a trick anymore or just some kind of, cute feature. This is a full way of thinking about images from now on in terms of two levels of frequency. Once you start splitting things apart like that, breaking them down, you can do things that you never really thought possible before because you're separating things and attacking them individually, which gives you a ton more flexibility. You can look at that pocket. I just rebuilt that in a minute. That was really easy to do. And previously, it would have taken a lot more work, probably some isolation to do that. But using these tools, I can do it in a much more painterly and a much more natural fashion. So far I've really been focusing on the methods that I'm using to remove these wrinkles, but I haven't talked much about the idea behind why I'm doing that. So what I'm looking for is anything that looks like errors in the manufacturing of the apparel. anything that looks like it's detracting from the form of the apparel. Now, this is one of those situations where your client's not necessarily going to mark all this stuff up for you. If they do, that's cool. Then the question for you is, do I stick only with the things that they mark up, or do I do additional stuff that I think looks good? That depends on your relationship with them and the situation. But lots of times the client is going to just hand it to you, mark up the big stuff that needs doing, and you're going to have to make these choices. I think I touched on this before. So I'm going through keeping the stuff that I think makes look realistic and removing anything that I think detracts from the product. So I'm going to move on from the shorts now. I can always come back and fix them later. You'll find yourself doing that a lot, is once you start peeling back all these layers of defects and distracting things, you'll kind of find more that you want to go back in and do. And that's the beauty of this system, is you can always go back during this process. So I think it's worth mentioning here that you can see what I'm doing. I'm not just cleaning the fabric, but I'm also thinking about the volumes and the shapes, the direction, and kind of the beauty of the fabric. So it's giving me a chance to make creative choices about those elements. I'm trying to preserve some of the actual movement that's in there in the fabric, and also make that more interesting and more formalized, and also just give it a little bit more of a sculptural quality too. So this is kind of a tricky situation because there's no information about the underlying anatomy of the athlete. It was mostly just folds and creases in the fabric that I'm removing. So once I start peeling that back, it can start to look really brushy and fake. Lots of times I'll just attack these areas right off the bat and try to get something that looks at least like 75% realistic, and rather than totally fixate on that and try to make, the most beautiful painting in the world right off the bat, I'll move on to other locations because I can come back to this and with a fresh eye kind of identify the things that I want to change. So I want to encourage you to move through the image like that. If you find problem areas, don't get stuck. Keep moving on, return to the ones that you think you need to fix and make better. An important thing to note here about cloning on the high is, since this is just made up of grain, basically, it's really easy to clone from anywhere, but the grain in different tonal areas is going to be different, so you need to change your clone source if you notice that the grain is looking a little bit different that you're putting in. So I've got to be a lot more careful once I move into this heavy mesh area here, but it's still so much easier than the old way that we used to do it, which would have been really tedious and a long process. Yeah, so a lot when I'm working this way, I just can't resist doing before and afters because I love seeing the results after spending so little time and having so much fun actually doing it. That to me, that change right there is epic. I could have never done that in that amount of time before. And you know, you'll notice that I kept a lot of stuff in here in the belly area. I'm probably going to go in and craft that stuff more because I don't think it's perfect. But that was one of the points that I made earlier about keeping that integrity of the image, keeping a level of authenticity. You want to leave some things behind so you just don't completely wipe everything and make it look fake. Now that you've seen what I can do with frequency separation, it's really important to talk about what I can't do. You might think that this is the magical cure-all for pretty much everything. There are limitations, a few, and I'll show you what they are. Mainly, what I'm talking about are these big structural folds in this area here. It's important for you with this newfound power to know when you've hit the wall of actually what you can say yes to. And that's always a negotiation. But when you have these major folds in here like this, you're not going to be able to wipe those using frequency separation because the high frequency information is so tied to the low frequency and what's going on underneath that we'd have to take pretty drastic measures in this case, like replacing this texture completely with maybe a scan of that area of the apparel or a reshoot to comp in there. But fortunately in this case, the client said they like the folds in this area, so we're gonna move on. You're probably asking yourself right now, oh my God, is he actually going to separate every single layer group and the pixels in there? Yes, I absolutely am. And you're gonna see that it's worth it. So your file size is gonna start to bloat, but keep working in this way and you'll find later how to scale this back in case your computer starts to hate you because you're creating a huge file that it can't deal with. And the flexibility, keep in mind, is worth it. All right, so I'm moving on to these tights. And I know this is going to be tricky because there's a lot of fabric texture in here tied up with some pretty prominent folds in the low. And I know the client would just like these to be at least minimized rather than necessarily completely wiped. So I'm going to go with a pretty low separation here and see if I can keep a lot of that information on the low and wipe it off and then maybe dial it back so that it looks realistic. So there's my low. I'm just going to hit this with kind of a brute force mixer brush wipe. Now, of course, that looks crazy fake. That's okay. And I'm just going to dial that opacity back a bit. And it brings a little bit of information back on the low that was originally there, but it just reduces those folds a bit. Remember, anytime we can just take one incremental step forward, at least that's going in the right direction. If you really need to attack something again later, at least you're moved in that direction and you can come back to it and try to hit it hard using other techniques. But just remember, you're combining all these techniques, these new techniques, with all of your skills in Photoshop. So something as simple as turning the opacity down on a layer to bring back some of the original detail is something you need to just keep in your head, these quick solutions to problems that aren't necessarily fancy, but draw on all of your experience using all the tools and methods in Photoshop. Now, I know I'm going to turn this area to black later, but I'm just going to try to, once again, reduce some of these big folds in here. See if I can take a step in the right direction. Now, I didn't separate these two tights from each other along this line, so I need to be very careful about this edge. I'm gonna throw a mask on that low that I did that work on. Bring up my brush, back to black, and just mask out any areas on the low that might have crept in. Yeah, just remove the halo from the edge there. Let's keep moving. I'm finished cleaning up all the apparel now. We're going to use frequency separation on the skin now, and with these new techniques and tools, it's going to completely change the way you retouch skin forever.